glad to have everybody involved. That's really good. Maybe we should go to the board and I'll make a list on the board of what we're thinking about today. And that way I can we can have a bit of a discussion about what we have going on.
And also, I just wanted to, I mentioned this to Colin already, but I have to pick my daughter up early today, so I might be distracted after 2 o'clock.
That's fine. No,
might need to duck out. So I'll do my best though.
that's fine. Okay, so let me just outline what I've got here sort of queued up for today, and then we can, I'm happy to solicit feedback on things. There's certain things I think are important to do. So the first thing is issues and policy. So we have this paper, this is this Nature Climate Change overview. I'm not going to go into detail about this. It's just, I think it's important. My feeling with modeling is that the crucial thing is to have a topic and have a framework for addressing the topic. That's the secret to getting a modeling approach sort of underway, is to have a topic. And I really think this border carbon adjustment is a really good one, because I don't know, in the literature, I don't know that there's a lot of work that's been done yet on the state level impact of these things. And clearly there'll be a pushback, although it's funny because on climate policy, there's always, you can identify exactly who's involved in energy intensive manufacturing, because they're the ones that are opposed to policy. On the other hand, as soon as you get a policy going through, then the bone that's often thrown to those groups is some sort of trade protection. And so there's always the political economy of this is interesting. It's like, so border carbon adjustments are likely to be there. I think there's lots of the energy intensive manufacturers would rather see all of our climate policy just be border carbon adjustment, right? Which is what won't achieve very much. So having a framework for assessing what drives that is really, I think, a useful way to get up the learning curve on the modeling. You want to have the modeling being driven by the policy, where you're interested in the policy, and that then it's less about the drudgery of working through the stuff and more about sort of curiosity about what's driving stuff. So I think that's important. I like to go back then to a paper of the fable of the elephant and the rabbit, which is a paper. So again, I'm sharing sort of my greatest hits of papers I really like in the past. This is a paper by Mann and he's at Harvard now, Hogan, that asking the question. It goes back to Alan's early work with the Ford Foundation in India, where he was a big fan of Rudyard Kipling and all these various Jungle Book sort of stories. And the fable of the elephant and the rabbit is, if you're making stew out of elephant and the rabbit, what's going to taste like? The rabbit's small, the elephant's big, but it depends on how pungent the rabbit is, right? And the analogy to energy and environmental things is energy is a share of GDP. What share of GDP is energy?
What's my GDP as energy?
What share of GDP is energy?
How many percent? Oh, how many percent? 25.
15.
Maximum 5.
Yeah.
Maybe 10.
So
10 if you go to Qatar or something, right?
Yeah. Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
But in the US, OECD countries, it's only 5.
5%.
So it's the elephant and the rabbit.
Yeah.
And so understanding this, and their paper gets at the essential issues. And the thing that's amazing, there's a paper from 1977 that still has relevance. It emphasizes the role of CES functions and the importance of understanding substitutability along a frontier when you move from one to another. It's okay.
Yeah.
It's fine. People either want to see the whiteboard or they want to see your head, but they don't want to see part of your person in front of the whiteboard.
Okay. Thank you. Got it. That's good. So going from that framework, then we'll go on to looking at CES functions. And then I'll keep this short, and I'll share the detailed algebra, but I'll basically give it. And the main thing of this is just to introduce. I have 2 Excel files that illustrate this. And for me, That's the best way to learn analytics methods is build an Excel file that visualizes what's going on. That's the most, then you can play with it. And then we'll go on to build an energy economy model. I'll say a Markson style model. And the idea of that is that I just want to keep it simple. I want to get the ideas straight. And I think it's better to have understand the little model before we go to a bigger model. Because if we're going to do border carbon adjustment, we have to think about climate policy, which means we have to think about the price elasticity of coal supply. We have to think about the energy demand for substitution between fuels and producing electricity. There's all this energy economy stuff we have to wade into. And I think before we jump into the WinDC framework to do that, let's first do this in the simpler setting. And then this afternoon, I'm not sure exactly where this will come. One of the things I'll use this model for is also, I wanted to complete, I was thinking yesterday evening about what we've not done yet in terms of programming constructs for doing sensitivity analysis with models. And one of the things we've not done is basically running models model instrumentation. And scenario processing, solution and comparison. Those are things that are techniques to doing that. In short, what we do is we set up, I rely very much on just writing a batch file that solves the models. And the reason you want to do this is you want to take advantage. You now have a new piece of hardware. In the last 3 years, we've moved into hardware. We have multiple processors, and you want to be able to use that. And the best way to use that for this sort of work is to set up a batch file and run a bunch of them in parallel. Right? So you want to be able to run scenarios together all at once, pull all the scenarios together and look at them in Excel. That's the main trick we want to do. So I want to show you the programming construct for doing that. It's relatively simple. It basically dumps all the stuff out and then sucks it all back in and sticks it in a spreadsheet so you can run them. And Jim tends to be, again, Jim's just charming. I love the guy enormously, but he's a little bit stuck in the 1990s for programming technique, right? So in the 90s, we'd always take GAMS and write all the script, a loop inside GAMS to solve all these things and pull all the results together. For larger models in particular, any model that has a large dimensionality, that's not a good way to do things. Because if you're doing a loop inside the thing, if one fails, then you screw up the whole job. And so you get up in the morning, go to see what your machine has generated while you're sleeping, and you discover it's screwed up at 9:15 at night and it's done nothing for the last 12 hours, right? Whereas if you do the batch processing method where you do one scenario at a time, you give it the batch file to do all this stuff overnight, you get up in the morning, oh, 5 of them failed. Okay, no big deal. Right? You can suck together the ones that didn't solve. So learning how to handle the machine. Again, this is the stuff that's been around. This scripting stuff is stuff it's the bread and butter of Linux-based web managers. Everybody who's in tech now, this is the way they work, and they've been working this way since 1970, right? So so it's just a matter of learning a few of these techniques that are their standard operating procedure. And I'll show you in there, I'll show you how to generate the stuff, even though we'll use this small model just to keep it simple. I'll show you how to set that up because then for the larger model, it makes sense. And then this afternoon, it's going to be WinDC, GTAP WinDC. But we're going to carry that into tomorrow morning. That's going to take a little bit longer. And so this afternoon we'll work on what does the model look like. I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but I'll just show you what MPSG looks like. I'll show you what the model, because that's the tool I normally use. And it's also because I forgot my power supply, so I don't have the algebraic version. The MCP version of the thing we'll do tomorrow morning. But we can look at the model. Also like to show you, at that case, I'd like to show a little bit about how to use GAMS for aggregation. So how to aggregate a data set, and that's very important. And that's, again, it's just these things that are essential things that you have to have in your toolbox. And one is when you work with a large data set that has lots of regions and sectors and so forth, the first thing you want to do is to develop a technique for collapsing the data set to a small number of sectors and regions. Because that way you want to have a small instance of the data set to use for doing the model development, because you want the turnaround on the model to be like 2 seconds. Run, try, run, try, run, try. It works, fine. Now we go back and pull a bigger data set in, run it with a bigger data set. So you always write the model and run, and this is what you get with GAMS if you use sets and so forth, is basically the model specification is completely separated from the data instance you're working with. So therefore you don't have to change the model at all, you just change the pointer to what data set to use and you can rerun the thing. And this is just absolutely, it gives you an enormous advantage in terms of efficiency for development. And it's important to bear in mind that in this game, a lot is made about clock time and CPU time, but in fact, the whole issue is calendar time. That's the whole thing, is calendar time. It's like from the time the policy gets discussed to the point where you have a model and results to contribute, it's the number of days it takes to get the model together. That's the whole thing that matters here. And so if we develop techniques that run longer on the machine, that doesn't really matter so much, having the dimensionality, but the way to get it to reduce calendar time is always produce a version of the model which is relatively compact. And so you always, as a modeler in a policy shop, if you're the modeler, you want to always have results. I have some numbers. It's a small data set. I have one with 4 regions and 10 goods. I can show you what comes out of the model at that point. I can share my pivot table. I'm working on a bigger one. Oh, here, I got one with 15 regions and 20 goods, right? So you want to always be having something operational on the topic, and then you're never done. You're always refining. Oh yeah, I'd like to do sensitivity with respect to this or that, but you want to get out in front of the pack. You want to lead by having an example that's operational. And even if it's a Markson style tiny model where you've understood exactly what's driving things, that's good for framing the idea, right? You're saying, okay, this is subject to a set of severe assumptions. This is a way that we can understand that. The whole point is that in this world, and Jim lives in this world, if you read his JGE paper, he works in this world of like theory-based numerics, letting the numerics guide your understanding of the theory. This is really useful, and you shouldn't be apologetic. It's like, it's a small model, but the fact is that if you've got the smarts to build the small model that's relevant, that's enough to have a seat at the table, right? It's like, it's not needed to have, you don't always have to have the largest data set, most recent thing. Of course, it's nice to be able to have a framework where you can pour a bigger data set in, but I think it's also good to be able to get stuff on. So this is sort of the game plan. Tomorrow morning, 6 would be GCHAP WinDC, the MCP version. And the idea is I'd like to take that model and connect it with the tools we did for sensitivity analysis and give you a model. It won't be a finished polished thing that's all ready to present, but we have something running that does border carbon adjustment issues in the WinDC framework and starts this process of understanding what drives stuff. So that's sort of what the plan is I have. There was a suggestion, Gilbin had the idea that it might be useful for us to solicit some input from you folks about things either that I've talked about now that I wanted to cover, or the last few days. So I'd be happy to get feedback from folks at this point.
Either way, right? Either way, we want to hear some voices.
I'm sorry, what was the question? You would like input on
Well,
what?
on the outline of what we're planning to do and things that may be not on the list or things that are on the list you don't, I'd just like to get some feedback. I'm flying a little blind with respect to folks that are outside.
I think what you mentioned is a good starting point for me. I jumped on a few minutes late though, so I didn't hear everything.
Okay.
But that works for me.
Anybody
Yeah,
else?
plan, sounds good. I mean, I just know for me, like, basically the devil's in the details, and I always start, it's when I really start getting into it that I start to have questions. So some of that might come later and might just have to be bugging by email and talking to Colin and Goulben and stuff like that. But I mean, I know just for myself, one thing I was planning to do is just because we had done the model before years ago, was basically taking just the very simplistic Steel 232 simulation we ran, which is it's just a 25% tariff, like nothing really fancy, and basically do it in GTAP, do it in this model, and basically try to just different types of models we have and compare the results. So that way, just try to understand how they differ, particularly in the results, or if they don't differ, and then see basically the strengths and weaknesses of each. So that's kind of like a going forward thing, not for this week, obviously, but that's something that I think I was kind of planning to do since
That
we
sounds
had
great.
that already.
That's a very good suggestion. Particularly if you have it already queued up in GEMPAK, it'd be really nice to do a set of runs where we have, because what we can do is we have 4 models. If you've got the GEMTAP implementation of GTAP, then we've got the GTAP model in GAMS, we've got the GTAP model in GEMPAK, we've got the WinDC models in open economy, small open economy, and then we have the integrated model. And it would be interesting to do those 4 simulations. And you do the Steel 232, I'm not sure. So it's just a 25% tariff.
Yeah, so way back when, God, I guess that was 2017. We used GTAP to figure out what tariff, or at least suggest what tariff they should put for the 232 investigation on steel. And they rounded it off to 25%. And of course, after that, it got a lot more complicated, but I was just thinking, just really just at its most basic, just blanket 25% tariff. Like, we don't have to do anything fancy, because it's not, we don't really care as much about the answer right now. It's more comparing the results. So it's just
No,
an
exactly.
extremely simple shock.
I mean, if we have, the thing about the WinDC framework, the GTAP WinDC framework, is that we've done if we've done this right, the national results should not be different at all from what we get.
No.
But we should have heterogeneity of impacts across states. And you can downscale the effects from GTAP and look at what, in other words, we can compare what we get out of the model with endogenous response to states to one where we do a first order approximation. So that's a very good suggestion. That's sort of outside the domain of what we're going to do this week, but that sounds
Sure. Yeah, that's not, I don't think that's a this week thing. That's a little bit later, but that is kind of like, I think what I was kind of planning to do after this week, assuming, we get some time, but.
One thing we're going to do this semester, we're going to keep there's quite a bit of interest in continuing to work on the WinDC GTAP sort of sessions on Tuesday mornings. And so this sounds like a very good topic for 1 week, would be to do a set of runs, have a simple scenario. And it doesn't have to be, all I have to do is do a scenario, and then you guys can take the model and do your scenario, right? So it doesn't have to be exactly the same, but basically set up the tools to do the comparison across the 4 different frameworks. I don't have a GEMPAK license currently, I don't think, but basically the various models we have to. I'm interested in how much we get from the endogeneity of the states versus there's this tops down approach where you just take the results from the national model and you have the data about the state level. You can say approximate. There's methods you can approximate what the impacts are. It shouldn't be that far off, but I'm kind of curious about how much we get from having the model be endogenous.
Yeah.
So good. That's a good suggestion.
Does anyone else have any suggestions? Martin, let's see, Jesus, Maxime. Or even just also something that you would like to see covered today or elaborated on?
I feel like I should be okay at the moment. I'm following along and taking it in.
I'm happy being a sponge.
Okay.
Same for me. I'm just following along here. Thank you.
The challenge is to have some of the surface water get absorbed rather than just running over the top. So, yeah, the one thing that I agonized over a bit this morning over breakfast, I was thinking about this energy model. It's because I can always go down rabbit holes, what's cool is we're very close to having a framework for looking at double dividend issues, right? So if you put in a government public expenditure and you have some distortionary taxes in place on labor and capital, then it's very easy to modify the model to look at the question about double dividend is this general notion that if we tax carbon that provides a revenue source and you can use it to reduce other distortionary taxes. And there's a whole big literature on that, and that we have a model where we can very easily generate that sort of stuff. So that's the interesting sort of other angle, but that's not, I think the border carbon adjustment is what's currently sort of the most plausible policy dimension present. So why don't we go to that first?
I just have one quick question. Maybe I missed this. The second topic that we have, the fable of the elephant and the rabbit. So how is it related to border carbon
So
adjustment?
border carbon adjustment says we're going to tax energy that changes comparative advantage, what happens to leakage rates and what happens to with border measures if you add it to an energy policy. The fable of the elephant rabbit steps back and says, what is energy policy? Like, how do we adjust? You know, if we're thinking about, that's really, in some ways, the BCA is a second order effect.
Okay.
The first order effect is we want to reduce carbon emissions. How do we do that? How much does the tax have to be? What's the impact back from the energy sector, which is a small fraction of GDP, on the rest of the economy? So this is a general question. And the main point of this is to say, as part of this is just to explain why it is we really, in this sort of application, we can't follow Jim and just use Cobb-Douglas functions everywhere. It's like, this is not possible. So you have to basically, you need this curvature to approximate the fact that the energy may be more costly to abate. The degree of the cost of reaching the target depends very much on the elasticity. And if you use a Cobb-Douglas function, you don't have the ability to do that. And it's also, part of this is also just it's a nice way to introduce CES, because their paper was written only like 4 years after the first paper on CES functions. So this is this was early on in the day. So it just was a way of going back. I wanted to tap this thing about the fact that people may not have seen this stuff before. I'd like to
Yeah, sounds great.
have that issue.
We got another question.
Nabil has a question or comment. Nabil?
Yes, I had one quick question for Dr. Rutherford about whether certain policy simulation I want to run would be appropriate for WinDC.
Okay.
So I'm trying to simulate the RCEP regional trade agreement, which entails tariff reductions for primarily countries in East Asia. It's not the US reducing any tariffs. So I was just curious. I mean, maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, but if you have a hunch as to whether I would get meaningful results at the state level for the US or something like that, or do you think it's not appropriate if it's not
the thing is, I
tariff
can't-
reductions for the US?
I don't know exactly what the magnitude is of the shock, so it's hard for me to comment on whether it's the effects at the state level are negligible, and I don't know which sectors are affected. But that sounds like a very useful, if that's something that's on the agenda, I think that using it as an exercise, I put it into this exercise of things that we should do on a Tuesday morning sometime in the next couple of months would be
Okay.
to run that through. I think that having a set, it's a funny thing because in some sense, all we're trying to do is to shake down the data set and the model, make sure we have, there's lots of details to finalize about how we do things. There's a question about how do we handle trade flows? Do we use some sort of gravity estimate to get flows between states, or how do we, there's all sorts of structural issues about the model, and having more compelling policy applications to help us identify what matters. That's actually very good. So this one would be, I'd be very happy to get the specification from you of how you were. I presume you're doing that in GTAP, or are you looking at this in a different framework?
That's right. Yeah, I'm looking at it in GTAP, and it could be something that I could bring up in the forthcoming meetings with the larger modeling group that we have.
No, that'd be really excellent, actually, to have if that'd be really good, because then that would go along with the steel tariffs to try to have a framework for how do we assess what's going on. And that's part of it is also learning. On the one hand, we're debugging the model, and the other thing is we're trying to get up the learning curve on what the workflow is, for working with the GTAP and GAMS framework. And so I tend to be a lot less, we don't have Windows interfaces. I can set up the model so there's one input file and one output file, but you're going to be much more productive if you can learn how to structure a set of simulations and pull the stuff together yourself. So learning these programming tools is useful. So having more things to look at that are relevant to folks in commerce is really helpful. So good. So RCEP, RCEP,
Yes, RCEP.
RCEP.
Yeah, the regional comprehensive economic partnership, I believe.
Okay, cool. That's great. The thing that generally happens is that the Washington can go crazy about trade agreements and their effects on the US, and it's absolutely completely vacuous. It's like all tempest in a teapot. I worked with the Colombians on negotiating the Colombia-US free trade agreement, and the effects were completely second order within the US. And so it's a little bit, it's always a challenge here. You're trying to report things that people really care about, and then you're the bearer of bad news that no, what you're saying has no basic, there's no effects at all. Right? And the main challenge, the reason that tends to be true, is that the US has very low tariffs to start with on everything. So you have to, of course, if the US raises its tariffs, then you can have bigger effects. But even like what we looked at yesterday, these disruptive policies are not that disruptive for the US. It tends to be very, very small. So, but I'm happy to look at it. That sounds good.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so I'll shift. Oh, and just the other thing about, I have to go, I'm afraid that an hour from now, we're going to have to take a break for about a half an hour because I have to run up to interview the candidate that I really like for this position in the department. Is going to interview with the personnel committee, and so I'm going to run up for half. If we take a break for half an
Yeah,
hour.
no problem. That's no problem.
That sounds-
Yeah. We got.
Remember how to do this. I don't use, this is from my colleague, Chris Moner. Now I just have to share my screen.
Yeah, that would be helpful. If you go to Zoom, the green button.
I got it. So is that up there now?
Yep.
Okay. So I think we sent this paper along. It's one there's a literature of stuff I've written about border carbon adjustments and leakage. I go back. Our original paper on leakage from 1993 is actually pretty good, and I have a paper from the Scandinavian Journal from 1992 that's actually very good too. But anyway, so I've this stuff I've been thinking about for a long time. It's like, and here we're trying to take stock. This is more of a literature review, which is not really my thing. I'm not so good at keeping my attention on things. If it's not a model involved, I tend to lose interest. But Christoph insisted that I be involved, so basically I'm kind of really lucky to have colleagues that are put up with my lack of focus. But okay, so the key thing here is that in this paper, we wanted to sort of basically, my original proposal was, the topic was border carbon adjustments, curb your enthusiasm, right? So it's like, the idea here is that we have to be kind of cautious about what we can achieve and not to shoot ourselves in the foot about these things. So the basic idea of these things was motivated largely by the prospect of carbon leakage. And leakage is a very specific measure that says the leakage rate is going to be the percentage change in emissions by non-constrained countries as a fraction of the abatement by constrained countries. And it all comes back to the idea that carbon is a global good, right? And where it gets emitted may have some transient effect, but in the long run, it's really a ton of carbon is a ton of carbon, no matter where it comes from. So the idea is that if we abate things, the rest of the world may not follow along, but will they actually get worse? And if our action causes them to get worse, then how should we think about that? And that's the key sort of challenge here. So this thing says your dirty coal is really the problem. Now we sell it to China all fixed, right? Is the concept. So that was the basic sort of idea. That was I had a student, Miles Light, did a thesis on this in 1998. So, and the funny thing was in 98, when we started talking about coal trade, in response, we were claimed people, we were accused of basically creating a problem that didn't exist, claiming the sky was falling, that leakage was going to be such a huge problem. And very shortly thereafter, from 1998 through to 2005, China went from being a net coal exporter to being a coal importer in a big way. And a lot of the coal that was being imported was coming from Australia, which had climate policy in place. So this was a direct, so the economic motives are definitely there, right? So the main leakage channels are going to be global energy markets. So that's the first thing, is reduced demand drives down global fuel prices, encourages more fuel use and emissions abroad. So reduced future demand can also cause fossil fuel response to lower prices. So there's this green paradox, the idea that if you have a hoteling mechanism for making decisions about extraction, the fact that you're driving prices down may actually induce you want to extract more of the energy early, because you don't, if they anticipate the end of oil, then you want to basically sell it while the market is still there. And then the other is also competitiveness. And the competitiveness is the challenge that basically in energy intensive, trade exposed sectors, that's EITE is the acronym. The acronym has changed a few times since I've been in this game. Early on, we had the acronym ICE, energy intensive sectors, but then it's more about energy intensive and trade exposed, right? So those are being traded. Those also, relative prices can change depending on what the energy content is of those goods. And that can cause also a surge. And the key thing we look at is brick manufacturing of steel, aluminum, these sorts of products. And it's not very hard to see. If we look at the energy markets, this is a pretty simple experiment. You look at supply and demand in the Marshallian setting. Rest of world demand may be down here. That's part of global demand. We have a shift through the coalition that reduces global demand by a certain amount. So that's the shift. It need not drive to zero, but it drives down by some amount. And that causes, as global demand goes down, come on, baby. Not. Sorry, I don't know what happened. I'm really a novice when it comes to using.
I don't know forecast of the size.
I don't know what's happening.
I think it would be our way.
I don't know. I kept clicking. I really hate Excel. I hate Office so bad. It's really awful. Let me see.
What are you trying to do?
I'm just trying to get rid of this so I can see what I'm doing. No, the minus, it doesn't go small enough.
Oh yeah, it does keep it there.
Hide. Man, I'm really bad. This stuff is so awful. Okay, so this goes like this, and then I hit this button here, I think, to get it bigger.
Yep. Yeah, people can see it now.
So energy moves over. That causes total consumption to contract. That causes the fuel price to go down, right? Which then causes an expansion. Rest of world consumption moves out by this amount. And you end up having this effect, that the leakage effect is shown down at the bottom. It goes down like this, but it goes down to here would be what you would expect to happen, but then there's a rebound through the effects of the rest of the world. And that's the whole, it's, we have a model that captures who consumes what goods. So there's lots of details. As Natalie said, the devil's in the details. Who's consuming coal? How tradable is coal? Who's consuming natural gas? What happens to oil markets? This is all stuff that's part of the game here, is like understanding the mechanisms through which this works. Lots of detail. And that's one of the themes of energy economy modeling, is this interplay between engineering perspectives on the problem and economic perspectives. That's sort of an ongoing sort of challenge. And so then that's where complementarity plays a big role, or can be very useful for this, because it's possible to embed the bottom-up perspective, the sort of technology intensive prescription can be embedded within the economic perception. So this is one of our challenges. But in this energy market thing, this captures this idea. A lot of this has to do with what gets substituted for what, how much leakage will we have. The competitiveness channel is not all that different. So we have this global supply contracts. This drives up prices. So the IT price, you can see on the left here, that caused the price to be driven up. That also has a similar sort of effect. IT, though, there's lots of, early on, that's oftentimes emphasized, the leakage channel through there. it turns out that even the most energy intensive goods, the IT market is relatively, I mean, we can decompose this in the Model S, but it's not going to be the dominant effect. And the other thing is that these sectors that we think about, energy intensive sectors, aluminum, bauxite, copper, all of these are process highly, the most energy intensive sectors tend to be the most process intensive. So they have a lot, you buy the plant, turn it on, changes in prices don't change what you do. You just run that plant. Now, your decision to replace the plant will be affected by prices, but in the short run, there's not a huge, the response is not very much. I had a paper in the World Economy a few years ago. We looked at copper, and man, it was like the last instance were very small. So here we have this trade embodied in carbon and trade in embodied carbon. That's sort of when I buy a new shirt that came from China, then you ask, well, what was the energy that went into making that shirt? Water processing. There's all sorts of things that go in, and this shows where does the carbon come from? Eastern Europe, energy intensive goods, India, South America, South Africa, Russia, and where does it go? Western Europe, largely the US. So this is where the trade comes from. Here we have a decomposition of direct and indirect sources of carbon. So we have the direct carbon is the darker line at the bottom, and this is non-OECD and OECD, non-metallic minerals, ferrous metals, non-ferrous metals, rubbers, plastic, and other products, and refined oil products. And I should say here that that's a sectoral composition we get in the GTAP model, which is sort of the standard size for most input output tables that they work with have around 59, 60 some sectors, and that's sort of the composition. We should be aware that there's one of the challenges here with embodied carbon is that there's high variation within those categories, so that we may be masking the overall effects may be different because of the sectoral disaggregation. But here we have a sense about, so there's the direct carbon, and then there's the electricity-based carbon, which is going to be this lighter gray area. And then we have indirect domestic, that's except for electricity, and then we have indirect imported. So we see, you're looking at the input-output table, and you're looking at how much carbon there is, and you can do a simple input-output analysis. You can just, so these data sets it's relatively simple to determine, to get a number for, and it's making all these linearity assumptions, so it's very dependent on making a very extreme structural assumption to do the calculation, but it does give you a sense about what matters. The challenge we have is that border carbon adjustment has to attribute how much carbon is on that. We import a t-shirt from China, how much carbon does that actually represent? Or we import steel, copper ingots from China. There are a lot of the smelting, they mine the raw copper in Chile, and then these plugs get sent to China, where they run all of the, do a lot of the very pollution and energy intensive manufacturing, and then those things can be shipped to be further processed downstream. So if you get an import of that, how much carbon is in that? How much carbon was embodied in that product when they mined it? How much of it was embodied when they did the smelting? How much was embodied? So there's a variety of different stages. And this sort of shows what the organization is. Our expectation is that getting electricity and direct energy is a start, but you can see that's only going to be about 40–50%, maybe 30–40% of the target. It varies from country to country. So who is actually exporting? So this is export of embodied carbon and energy intensive and trade exposed goods for non-OECD countries. So OECD, and here we see, China has very high exports, and you can see the magnitude of the exports and what the carbon intensity is. You see that China is the largest one. I should say that that's a number, carbon intensity there is around 250. When I first started looking at this issue in the early 90s, we had numbers that were 3 or 4 times higher than that. And one of the things that's changed in the near term is that a lot of the electricity that's being produced in China is now being produced in much more efficient, typically coal-fired plants, but the carbon, this is something that evolves with the production process. So if we look at OECD countries to OECD and non-OECD countries, so we can see EU, Germany exports lots of plastics and chemical products. The US has exports of coal and so forth. So that tends to be, and South Korea is largely steel. Japan is probably steel as well. So there's basically steel products. And then we look at what the shares are. So import shares of non-OECD and OECD. So we see what import share in the US, non-ferrous metals, about 14% is imported. And then export share from OECD to non-OECD. So you get a sense about what the distribution is and which sectors matter. And of course, then if we blew these sectors up and captured, had more, and you could do that actually, we haven't done this analysis. You can go to HS60 to the taste data set or OTAT or one of these other ones. And you have to go to a bigger IO table. So in the US, so that means you can't get most recent statistics, but you go to a table that's 400 or 500 goods, you get a sense about that. So there's a variety. It tends to be concentrated in certain sectors. So how much, the reason we want to have border carbon adjustments, we're worried about leakage, but empirical studies don't find a lot of leakage. Modeling estimates are typically in the range 5 to 30%. There are numbers in the literature going from minus 15% to 120%. So there's always, there's lots of vested interests on this number. And so there's lots of different numbers that can come forward. The numbers that exceed even 20%, I tend to be kind of skeptical about. The trade elasticities don't suggest that's likely to be the case, but that's, so this gives the range. So, and if you want to see a set of studies that compare across different countries, you can go to EMF in Energy Economics 34. We have a little model comparison study on this specific issue about, I don't know, boy, it's been 10 years now, but so we did a fairly careful model comparison project. So it's higher for specific sectors, and that's the reason the disaggregation may matter. Steel and cement are probably the two that are most sort of prominent. So what's the solution to this? Global carbon pricing is definitely a solution, but it seems that we're far away from that. I mean, again, if you're just getting into this game and you haven't, you want to learn a little bit more about policy related to carbon, I recommend a book by a political scientist from Michigan, Can We Tax Carbon by Barry Rabe. It's really quite good. The bottom line is no, but it's basically he enumerates, he goes through and looks at efforts to do this and puts forward the challenges. Fundamentally, it comes down to the fact that highly visible policies, which can't be justified in terms of cost benefit calculus in the short term, are really hard to keep in place. So that's probably the most prominent counterexample would be the pricing of petroleum products in Europe, where you have basically it's been argued that the reason that Europe is able to keep these energy taxes in place is because they're dependent on the revenue. So the idea is that basically, if you got rid of oil tax and fuel taxes in Europe, then suddenly a big hole in government revenue, they have to raise taxes even more, and value-added tax is already pretty high. So the claim is that I've heard it asserted that that's the reason that these taxes remain in place. I'm not certain of that hold water, but that's a consistent story. Yeah, in the US, so the thing is, if we could get a carbon tax in place and become dependent on it and use it to buy down other taxes, then it might change the political calculus. But putting it in as a supplementary thing, and particularly that's where I oftentimes I fret a little bit about the messaging about climate, is this portrayal of this being this is an urgent matter we must attend to, sort of suggest that to people, okay, well, if we put in a bunch of windmills, then it'll be home free. And actually, that's not the case. The problem is that the time horizon, the reason this is a super wicked climate is a super wicked policy problem is because the time dimension is so long. And so it's not something to solve really quickly. And that's the reason leakage is something that's always going to be there. So global demand on energy markets, so we've already been through this. So you think about what's going on. I somehow, I think I switched. think I switched policy. I think I
Oh,
switched.
look, right, there's one.
I think anyway, I'm screwed up. So it's basically, I apologize. So energy intensive traders, both sectors, steel, metals, pulp and paper, chemicals, glass, ceramics, cement. So all these things are relevant. And there's been a bunch of work done on this stuff recently. There's Meredith Fowley's work on cement is really good. There's in this thing to promote national security, we must punish the #1 exporter of steel to the US. China? No, Canada. Is China number 2? No, that's Brazil. But China's number 3, right? No, that's South Korea. Number 4, number 5, number 6, number 7, number 8, number 9, number 10, Mexico, Russia, Turkey, Japan, Taiwan, Germany, and India. But these tariffs will hurt China the most, right? No, that would be the US. So
This is China's number 2.
Yeah. So there's, the problem here is that we have this, again, it's this feeds in directly to the challenge. So there are options for addressing competitiveness related leakage, sectoral agreements. So give trade partners incentives. We can't do that unilaterally. You have to do that collectively. Exempting susceptible sectors. So to lose all incentives for abatement there, don't. So if you exempt, again, that's a paper we did in GAMS in 1995. In Germany, they proposed climate policy. They're going to let all of the energy and sectors be basically exempt from the whole process. And it's like, it's crazy, right? So it's like,
That's fine.
and then you can have output-based rebating. That's a method that a lot, again, energy intensive sectors love that. It's a classic example of using cap and trade in the electricity sector is always enthusiastically received by electricity producers because typically there's, the grandfathering of permits to the existing emitters. So this is the classic problem. So border carbon adjustment seems to be the thing that sort of people agree with, but the problem is that it doesn't do very much, right? So it's a very blunt instrument for dealing with the policy we have in mind. So it implements destination-based carbon pricing like a VAT. It levies a charge on imports, measure the carbon content for foreign product, measure the carbon price in the implementing country, and so the principle is we know the carbon content, we know what the carbon price is, we know what the tariff is. The problem is that, as we saw in the previous slide, that carbon content involves all sorts of different components. There's the direct energy, there's the carbon that's embodied in the electricity, and then there's the imported intermediates. And a lot of these sectors have a lot of intermediates, right? Think about copper, think about steel. There's all sorts of stuff that's embodied. And so the calculation is not so obvious. And we also move toward something that's similar to the way anti-dumping is calculated now, that we have these anti-dumping duties have to do with some sort of input-output calculation of what the minimum price is and whether you're dumping. And so this basically opens up this whole, it becomes very litigious and becomes a cottage industry to calculate these things and to contest them. So this is this overall challenge. You could relieve exporters of embodied carbon charges, and then there's in this literature on border carbon adjustment, there's lots of stuff written by lawyers about what's WTO compatible and how does this actually work. So the basic sort of decision is sectoral coverage, default emissions intensities, pricing compliance mechanisms, credits and exemptions, exports, continued to free allocation, use of revenue. All these things are a matter, and it becomes to the front because of the EU's Green Deal plan to get, for carbon neutrality in Europe by 2050. Border carbon adjustments are right there, and they apply to the US. So that's the challenge. So literature on this has largely been thinking about, what this, and so then we're left with this sort of impact assessment. Is this, what's the magnitude of this effect? Leakage reduction, yes, but limited to competitiveness channels. Output protection of energy intensive and trade exposed countries, yes, but export rebates can be crucial. Regional, there's burden shifting, and is it cost effective? And our finding is basically that the key thing is that there are lots of countries that have border carbon adjustments. It's definitely the one thing that's always clear is that this, from a competitiveness profitability standpoint, this is always good for the protected sector to always do better. But if you sort of level the emissions. And so the way in the modeling work on this, and we'll do this in a computation. You can modify the model such that you vary the target so you hold global emissions always the same. That's always the challenge in this sort of calculation, is to say, what's the incidence of this? Well, if we have global emissions are moving up or down, we can't really trust what the economic cost index is. Is you put the border carbon adjustment in, that changes what global emissions are. So the way we typically do that is to assume that the target within the countries applying the tariff adjusts so that we are comparing across outcomes for the same global emissions, where the border carbon adjustment simply changes what the target has to be. And so in that setting, you can assess what the efficiency gains are, and we don't find that there's a lot. So that's the challenge here, is that this is a policy that has and it's, how to assess it and so forth is interesting. On the other hand, if BCA is what makes it possible to get a quorum together to start implementing climate policy, maybe that makes it, okay. So in this talk, my objective was just to raise what the issues are, and then I wanted to go back now to sort of go back to first principles about how do we worry about energy economy trade-offs for abatement, and then we'll move gradually back to a more complicated model. So the idea is to a model where we can do a calculation of a BCA policy tomorrow morning. That's my objective. I see my time. This was only half hour, so I apologize for being a little bit short.
Oh, no, you're good. Do you have to go at 10?
No, 10:30.
10:30, okay.
Half hour. So we can shift over to the elephant and the rabbit if that's okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And as I said, I have this other talk by another co-author, Carolyn Fisher. She's now head of climate, or she has a position at the World Bank in charge of these sorts of issues. So her talk is very, very good, much longer. And I didn't feel that there's a lot more of the policy nuance that I'm not an expert on, but there could be guys in your group that could benefit. So I'll share that. I'll share those slides with you, but I won't go through them now. One more, compile this guy one more time to make sure I'm on the page. I wanted to include this because I like the motivation of this is interesting. I perhaps have more. This is a bit longer than I needed to be, so I'll just jump through some of the stuff. I also have this sort of fondness. We always have a fond memory of our advisors. My advisor, Alan Mann, is a really remarkable guy. So I like talking about his stuff. It's kind of fun. And this paper is good because it's so far ahead of its time, and it gets the essence of this. And it's really this thing about what's the value share of energy. I mean, if you ask engineering students here, what's the value share of energy? They're up like 50-60%. They think everything's energy, right? But the fact is it's small. So that's the challenge about this, is that in the overall scheme of things, climate is a problem. If you believe that there's an existential threat to the world through this, which many people believe, and I think that there's lots, then this should not be a problem. We should be able to just say, get rid of coal. That'd be the first thing you do, is like stop burning coal, bring in renewables, bring in other things to back off, raise price of energy. And the standard story is always going to be, the policy solution is decarbonize electricity and then electrify everything. That's the standard thing. The problem is that we have this politics of discontent is like prevalent around now. So there's always vested interest in this problem. So that's what makes this. The thing that's interesting is, so we think about Alan. So just, I'll try not to reminisce too much, but it's basically. So let's see. Actually, so born in 1925, received his BA from Harvard when he was 18. So he didn't start when he was 18; he finished when he was 18. served as a destroyer in the Pacific, World War II. If they hadn't dropped the atomic bomb, they would have been involved in the invasion of Japan. Came back and got his PhD in economics shortly thereafter. So he finished his PhD in like 4 years. He came back in 46, and he also was an innovator. He was in the economics department, but he worked on linear programming models for oil refinery operation. So it turns out that thesis actually had a bigger effect on the way the world went, because essentially once they showed is the combination of the simplex algorithm together with a demonstration of the usefulness of this for identifying optimal blending for refineries, where you can bring different types of crude oil together to produce different products, and you can improve. The crude oil refinery is going to be moving continuously, but if you can adjust the policy, you can increase profits by 5-10%. Boom, it makes lots of money, and you can buy lots of computers for that. And so, in fact, a lot of early on was the idea, let's show them how to use computers to schedule refineries, and then let's learn how to use the tools that they use for scheduling refineries to solve economic problems. So that was the basic sort of theme here. So faculty appointment at Yale, mentored by Charlie Koopmans. If you haven't read Koopmans' Nobel address, it's a really good one. It's right up there with, I think, there's several of these are really good. The one on climate was actually kind of disappointing, but the, yeah, I mean, if you look at Paul Krugman's address, it's really good too. But Charlie Koopmans was concept to optimality, which is really kind of a cool thing. And his research, Alan's research, focused on multi-sectoral models for development planning. He worked a lot with the Ford Foundation, the Rand Corporation, joined Stanford Office Research Department in 1967. He was at the Rand Corporation. He had shared an office on one side with Herb Scarf working on inventory policy, and on the other side was Harry Markowitz inventing risk return. So it was like in the center of the development of things. Yeah, and the faculty appointment at Yale, and there's this mystery about why he didn't get tenure at Yale. It's really kind of amazing because he had like 5 AER publications and a ton of Metrica. Is like crazy, but I don't know what my personal suspicion is it had to do with anti-Semitism, but whatever it was great for me. He ended up at Stanford because I never would have. When I got to school, here I'll talk a little bit about this. So here he is with Danzig and Mann, Hilliard, Eichelhart, Vienot, Coleman, Lieberman, Arrow, Cottle, right? All these guys were like giants. They formed this department of math programming like 1967 was the start, 1965, around that time. It was this idea about, they had a grand sort of agenda, and they had a really stellar group, and they basically the department never hired other people. It just stayed with these guys all the way. I got there in 1980, and it was still, these guys were still going. They subsequently hired some younger guys, but then at that point, the department got merged with industrial engineering, and so it's no longer the same, but it was a really great department. I had never taken an economics course, but I'd worked as an engineer. So there I am in Peace Corps with my bridge crew building a suspension bridge in northern Lumjung district in Nepal, 125 kilometers from the road. The guy next to me, Harkalal Gurung, had been a Gurkha in World War II and driven a jeep for a British general across from Delhi across into Indochina, had been fighting the Japanese in Borneo. And all these other guys were just amazing guys. So this was, for me, I came back from doing that, and the cool thing about the bridge is you can say, I'll brag a little bit. It's fun. Being old is fun. And you guys can just say, well, Rutherford just started bragging. If you do a thing, you say, Siyange Bridge, Lumjung district. You don't even say that, you just say Nepal. So we have on the images. Then boom, you get pictures of Nepal there, and there's a new one, right? So it's our new bridges. That's a new picture. I hadn't seen that one before. So there. Let's see if I can one of these bridges. So,
Maybe click on it. You gotta go then scroll down. Click a view file. There you go.
So there's a picture of the bridge. So that was the first bridge I built. Cool thing about the bridge was this bridge was built for 210,000 rupees, which was about I don't know, $60,000. And there was a bridge that had been built for like 20 times that much money by the Swiss downstream. And I saved money by putting the cables into the cliffs. So we had to, so it's fun. So basically, I had a great time. When I finished engineering, I thought I was going to be an engineer. And I came back from doing this work in Nepal. It was kind of like, it was just really fun. It was like building tree houses or something. So that's 2012. And this was, I came back into the OR department and I was looking for someone that would support me. There was money in 1980. You could go to graduate school for free, essentially. There was money from federally funded work study. You just find somebody who said, oh yeah, I can use you. And so I went in and my first conversation with Alan Mann was about the fable of the elephant and the rabbit and the 6 blind men, right? So this was this idea about, 6 men of Hindustan. This is a great, I'll leave it in the slide. You can go off and read it. It's fun. It's basically this idea that the world is a complicated place and there are many ways of looking at it. And each has, so the 6 blind men that come upon the elephant, one holds the tusk, the other grabs a leg, the other one grabs the trunk, another one grabs the tail. They all have different stories. And Alan was like really great. And so he convinced me that, and there's my favorite Hell's Library thing is learning to build models, but also learning a little bit about the role of economics. I'd never taken an economics course when I got there. And so Alan was really great. And this was one of the ones, the 2 papers that had the biggest influence on me when I was a master's student were this paper and the paper and the Nobel address by Koopmans were both really influential. I was determined not to get a PhD though, because I thought all PhDs were pinheads and I didn't want to be a pinhead. So I finished my master's degree and went to work in Norway for after that. And that's where I worked with Lars Mathisen, the guy who has the modeling format was here. But this paper, this elephant and rabbit paper is really great about energy economy interactions and what it costs. At that time, the concern was energy is, we have national security issues because we're importing too much energy. We shouldn't be importing so much energy because we become dependent on it, which is not that different than the current dialogue about, how do we avoid dependence on long supply chains? It's the same sort of issue. And the question is, okay, how do we push on this stuff? We have to raise the price of that stuff. How do we do that? Right? So this is the bit. And so this one is from 1977. So the basic story here is in many policy settings, the energy sector is appropriately viewed in isolation. So that's the basic story that says that we could use a Marshallian model to look at this effects. This may be inappropriate because there may be two-way interdependence between energy and the rest of the economy. So a large change in the energy markets may represent a small share of aggregate economic activity, but it depends on how important energy is to the rest of the economy. So there's this need for a two-way rather than a one-way assessment. It depends very much on this linkage between the two. And this is basically saying, rather than, ultimately there's this role for bottom up, and certainly in energy technologies, all of these details of, which countries are, producing. If you look at Norway, they're producing aluminum through hydropower. Yeah, there's some emissions that come from the process, the chemicals, but basically it's much less carbon intensive than if you buy aluminum from, say, South Africa, or there's other places where they make it with carbon intensive energy. So all these bottom up concerns matter, but you'd like to have a simple model to get the concept straight. So this idea of theory of numbers, let's try to think about that. And so this is reflecting on what it takes to get that perspective on the energy impacts. So the energy share of GDP is typically over 4 to 5% in industrial countries. This is something like elephant rabbit stew. If a recipe contains just one rabbit and one elephant, doesn't it still taste very much like elephant stew? And the question is, depends on how flavorful the rabbit is, right? So it depends on how much we're going to raise the price of energy. Well, how much will this cost the rest of the economy? And so this value share, and it really comes down to, if that value share rises, then it becomes more important. And that's the other way of thinking about it, is that as the price rises, the value share gets bigger. And the question is, how much bigger does it get? And that's, if it's Leontief, then the value share is more or less proportional to the energy price. So the energy price goes up by a factor of 5, and you can do the calculation on what it means. Carbon price goes up to $150 a ton, which is sort of in the range of what probably would be required to reach the targets that were negotiated in Paris. oil prices go up by a factor of 3 or 4, right? So this is we have a bigger effect. And the question is how much of an effect does this have? And that's this the general sort of question. And a lot of this, and this paper was largely written to an audience that kind of modelers who either did, at that time, the idea was either do Cobb Douglas or you do activity analysis. So the idea that we have to have somewhere in between. So this is trying to motivate that there's this other framework that can capture a range of effects. And this is this elasticity of substitution concept. I tend to think about elasticities as being economic characterization of cost. The beauty of them is that you can look at variations in energy prices and estimate these responses, so you can get an empirical estimate. It doesn't mean the empirically estimated method is always the best response, because you have to ask yourself, how far outside the domain of observed variations in price are we talking about? So if we have an ex-ante policy that says we want to reach 2 degrees C, or we want to go to net carbon zero, net zero by 2050, man, that's something that's going to require a price response, which is much bigger than it's been informed. So perhaps this method is not the best way. On the other hand, if we're saying, okay, what's it going to cost if the next few years we raise the carbon price, to $50 or $25, then empirical estimates are probably more relevant. That's where this basic tension between bottom up, that's technology. So the engineering approach to climate is to think about, enumerate all the technologies that are on the shelf. They're not technologies that have been used, but they're available. We raise the price, one of those is going to come off and be used. And that's the bottom up sort of modelers are all about knowing what's on the shelf and being able to characterize that. Whereas if you're a top down guy, then you want to say, what's this elasticity that tells me roughly what the cost is. So if we look at this in the this idea, this range of infinitely elastic, that means we can move between energy and other inputs. If they're perfect substitutes, we have a line like that. If it's unitary, that's Cobb Douglas, then it looks like this. And then if it's zero elasticity, it looks like that. And really the idea here was that this gives us basically what was on the plate. And the idea of the CES form is that it provides a framework that can fill in all the blanks. And I'll explain how that looks momentarily. So CES, a coherent, self-consistent model of energy. Most empirical estimates of the elastic demand for energy is between 0.2 and 0.6. So energy intensity. So this is basically looking at things. And a lot of it's a term that Ellen invented, is autonomous energy efficiency improvements, AEEI. And there's also this process of how much energy demand has been changing due to just process improvements in overall technology. So motivations were environmental protection, national security, and sustainability are the same sort of notion we have today. What size of tax is required to achieve a given result? What's the effect on GDP? So here they're thinking about 2010 as being their target, but they're looking at the overall effects, and also exhaustion of oil was a big issue. So at the time, and this is basically the diagram that shows the elasticity is infinite. You can reduce it. You just simply substitute away from energy, no effect. On the other hand, as the elasticity goes down to 0.1, you have a much bigger effect. So this is just making the point that in a simple, and this is just a back of the envelope calculation of that. And this is basically this idea about capital mobility and substitutability plays a role. This is an issue we can look at in our framework. So the model they look at is a very simple one. Maybe what I'll do is I'll jump to the CT rather than, so this is their framework, is basically looking at this value share. This is looking at they're saying output is a function of E and R. So R represents labor and capital inputs, all other variables. E is energy. So you think about it as though we're going to substitute away from coal, from energy, and the substitution is that we have to put in a lot of windmills and maintain them, or we have to put in solar panels. So R is the cost, the capital cost of other things. So this captures the essential trade-off you have. And it says energy is required for output. So this doesn't have this idea that there's also decarbonization that can take place in terms of end use. So the innovations like, was not anticipated here, you have innovations like diode lights, and there's a variety of other things that can change the energy content, what the energy content is of energy services. So this gives you the basic framework, and then essentially from that optimization problem, you know, if the value share is approximately is small, then this shows the overall effect. This shows a back order value share of energy doesn't remain constant. That shows the solution to this problem tells you what the overall affair is. So if you have the elasticity is approximately if the share is small, then this gives us the overall effect to changes. So the implication is that basically we expect that the fundamental idea is that as energy prices go up, the value share of energy rises. How fast it rises depends on the elasticity of substitution. If the elasticity is very high, if we're over a 1, if we're a 1 or greater, then it's not a problem. If it's closer to 0.1, then it becomes a real problem. And this top-down view predicts, and typically estimates are usually around 0.5, but that's sort of an overall top-down. So this is capturing what the overall, this insight is what drives most of the estimates of the cost of the GDP cost of climate policy is driven by this very point right here. Okay, so that gives us this partial government approach, you know, biases. And the reason we build a bigger model is basically to capture, we want to get technologies in the model. We want to have this idea that there's differences in different sectors. We want to capture the fact that certain sectors are more energy intensive than others. Certain goods are more imported. There's all this effect where we're going to, whose ox gets gored. That's essentially what drives things. And so the drive to build a bigger model is mainly to get a better sense. But the overall effect is the idea is captured in this paper. So overcoming these shortcomings is the basic challenge. So thematic and policy dimensions of this paper are topical, you know, many years after the publication. Energy security, environmental costs, sustainability are also at the forefront. The CES demand system continues to be the workhorse of applied equilibrium analysis. It makes me a little bit nervous because there's this tendency this is received wisdom about how the world works. And the fact that we have, when we do this energy model comparisons with border measures, we get lots of models that produce the same number. I get kind of nervous about the fact that maybe it's just they're all using the same elasticities. They use this. If everybody uses GTAP, everybody makes the same assumption of elasticity, then they all give the same result. And the fact you have many models giving the same result doesn't mean that that's more likely. It just means that a lot of research groups did the same thing, right? So that's the challenge. So this is basically how this works. And yeah, I've already talked about the model. So that's what I got here. Let me just jump to this. I'll jump to the spreadsheet, and maybe I won't even go through if I look at the CES model. So first, just look at CES demand. And so this is just, rather than going through lots of algebra, we'll just collapse the ribbon. So there's a spreadsheet. It's nothing, there's a spreadsheet with a bunch of numbers in it. And it's got some controls. So if I go over here, so I essentially do I have a bunch of exogenous inputs. Px0 is the reference price of X. Theta X is the value share of X. Sigma is the elasticity of substitution. Epsilon is the elasticity of aggregate demand. We have Px and Py are the scenario prices of these guys. I can stick some controls in there and run those from little buttons on the other page. And then I have some implicit calculations here. I then figure out what are some points that describe the budget line, the angle curve, all this sort of stuff. These are some calculations I do for additional points. And then I go down here and I write out, I do some algebra around the CS function to show me where the points are on the isoquant. And so that's everything that you see is all there. That's the whole spreadsheet is driven by this one set of inputs. And then if we go in here, then we can say, okay, so if I look at this guy, I've got a benchmark value share of X. So if I shift this guy down or up, then it goes down to the right. If I shift it this way, oh, let's come on, guy. Let's,
It was working.
this is typical. How does this not work? Why? I'm annoyed. Let me close it and open it again. So if I look at this, so the benchmark value share, if I make this guy go up, it's only going one way. What's going on with this thing? So how do I, to be honest, I learn enough Excel to do things and then I always forget it. So Excel make unlock controls. Does anybody know how to do that? I can't remember how to do that.
I would do the same thing. There you go.
Right click on the button, format control, look at the protection, but it doesn't let me format it. So I can't.
Let's see if the other ones work.
Now, so that part works. It's just the value share doesn't work. I'm not sure what's going on. And this one, no, the down buttons are not working. Man, it's really weird. Anyway, so there's a spreadsheet. I apologize. You can hit the, and I don't understand. So I don't, there's stuff I don't understand.
So these are just different values.
Let me see the other, let me see if the other sheet works better. So this is one that's just a choice model. The other one is more complicated. So this guy has the benchmark value share. Let's make that, make sure this guy can go smaller and it can go bigger. So I don't know what happened to the other sheet. I think I screwed up. So here we have, so the way to think about CES functions is give me a point that represents demand. That's just demand. And that gives me a point on the line here. So then I can move that point up and down without changing what the reference prices are. That simply changes what the reference quantities are.
Yeah.
The prices are the slope of the line. If I change the elasticity of substitution, make that higher, it gets flatter. If I make it smaller, it goes like that. So if it's 0, it goes like that. So that, and it's important to bear in mind that in the CES world, the curvature determines the elasticity of demand for the good. So therefore, if I make it smaller, then it becomes tighter.
So this, what you were just doing, kind of, you had in the slides, right? With
Yeah.
that old image from Man's paper.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
essentially what Man's paper is essentially what this is. This is just a
Yeah.
implementation. Then we can change if the income goes up. So this is an uncompensated demand that caused demand to go out. If the demand, the cost function, the demand function is homothetic. So if as income expands, it expands along a line that's parallel,
Mhm.
right? If I change the price of X, if I make X cheaper, then you substitute away from that line. And how far you substitute depends on elasticity. Here, the elasticity is 0.5. If the elasticity gets higher, then you're moving further and further away from the line, right? That represents what, so this is the income. If the income goes back, there's a substitution there. And that's looking at the price of the goods. If Y becomes more expensive, then you move. So this is basically capturing both sides going on. Okay, so that's just this idea about, and so what is driving the model? What's driving the model is what's the anchor point on the reference point? Where is demand at this point? So here, if I go, so the first thing is, what's the benchmark value share? That's how much do we have demanded of these two guys? And then the other is, what's the elasticity? How much do I substitute away from the thing, right? And then in the counterfactual, then what happens to the scenario income? What happens to the scenario prices of the goods? That determines additionally where this guy goes. So that's, and then if I look at my PDF file, so this is calibrated CS demand. This is just relatively short. I just have one example here. So Thomas lives in Ann Arbor, currently spends 30% of his income on rent. has employment offer in Zurich, which pays 50% more. But he's reluctant.
This is a real life example.
He's reluctant to take the job because rental rates for housing in Zurich are 3 times higher. Why is it that he might be reluctant?
Because they are equal. I mean,
So to have the same size house and spend the same amount of money on other stuff, 3 times higher, 3 times 30 plus is equal to 90, plus the 70% he spends on other goods means he have to have 160%, or he's only getting 150%. Right.
So he will have to pay it all to the rent.
Well, that's the question here. It's like it depends. Okay. What does it depend on? Yeah, elasticity. It's
Yeah.
willingness to
And
substitute.
willingness to-
If I'm happy, I have this theory that people who lives in California, people who are willing to live in a postage stamp and spend all their time outside on skateboards.
Yeah.
If you live in,
I don't have to eat.
if you live in LA, you just have a bikini and a skateboard. Your apartment is just a single flat, it's tiny because it's expensive to live there. That's certainly, maybe not LA, but certainly in San Francisco, that's the case. People live in very small apartments. And they may decide to live there. So there's a sorting of people according to their preferences. So if we want to do this calculation, Tom's offer doesn't now pay him enough to live exactly the same lifestyle he enjoys in Ann Arbor. We'd need a 60% raise to cover that. So let's say substitution is key. If it's high, then he's willing to substitute consumption of goods for services of housing, and thereby lowers his cost of living. So if he lives in a smaller flat, he might be way better off, right? So on the other hand, if the elasticity is low, he's stuck in his ways, then the move's not a good idea. So this is this question about, and for Americans, some Americans oftentimes don't want to move because we're accustomed to having 5,000 square foot houses, and you know what do you mean? You have to live in 100, 1,500 or 800. It's like this.
Oh, 800 is good.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, a
So-
lot of
I lived
people
in
move to New
600.
York.
That's right. New York's the same thing, right? So this is, so we're giving her information about his choices in Ann Arbor. It's essentially an observation of the benchmark equilibrium. So this is a general equilibrium model, right? We observe what the choices are. We observe prices and quantities. We have to assume what an elasticity is, then we look at how he responds, and we ask, is he better off or worse off? So it's really nothing other than a general equilibrium calculation. It's like, there's some data, you describe stuff, and this is the essence of, library of hell. It's all word problems. It's all about being able to identify, this is the issue. This is the way I can think about it. I can tell you not the answer, but I can tell you an answer that depends on an assumption I made. And that's Markson and I and my students, and that's our whole thing about equilibrium modeling is it's not one model. It's just a way of thinking about things. It's a set of tools you have. You get posed with a question. You can go off and grab some data, throw it together, do a calculation, get some insight into it. That's the reason my models never have names. I practically never do a model. I never do an application where I don't build a new model. I may begin from an existing model, but I very rarely have a model that has a 400-page description of all the various inputs and how you modify this and that. It's like, I regard that as it takes way more attention than I have. My attention span is not good enough to handle that. But basically, I think it's much nicer to have a framework for how to evaluate stuff. So here's the graphical representation. So you can see here that this is showing other goods. The gray line represents sigma star is going to be the elasticity such that he's exactly indifferent. Because here we have the budget line at the new place. The original consumption point is outside the new budget line. So we can't afford to live out here, but he can. So here's a point up here where if the indifference curve here is exactly tangent to that line, then that's an elasticity such that he's completely indifferent. If he moves, he's going to move from a flat to a point that's at B. He's going to increase his consumption of other goods and decrease his consumption of housing. And if his elasticity is lower than alpha star, he doesn't want to move. The red line, there's no point that he can get to that's going to make him better off or equally well off. But if he's got a high elasticity, sigma H, that's the flatter thing, then of course he's going to move because he's going to be much better off. Right? With the higher one, he's not gonna end up at D, he'll end up even further up, right? So even a smaller place. Did you get the logic?
Yeah, the intuition, yeah. He can't,
And all
basically, if
the-
his elasticity is below, he can't reach.
Yeah.
He's gonna be below if he moves to B,
Yeah.
where you wanna be at that point, if he was consuming that many goods, right?
So again, now we're gonna go through the math of this thing. Here's a utility function. Exponent rho is the primal formal exponent. We have a elasticity sigma. The model of consumer choice is this guy maximize utility subject consumption spending plus housing spending is equal to income. We normalize the price of consumption to being 1. And then you can, and here I go through the basic math of this stuff. And that's where, again, that's one of the things that I'm really big on is that when we do the modeling, I don't want to do math, right? I don't want to do the math. I want to know the math well enough that I can just use it. And that's the reason I like you guys to think about the model in terms of we have compensated and uncompensated demand functions, full stop. Those things are something we can draw. That's a detail. We know that when we put in the benchmark prices and benchmark income, they will give us back the benchmark point. And we know there's an elasticity controls thing, but we don't want to basically let the algebra seep into what we're doing because it basically gives you room for mistakes. That's the reason the model specification, if you can write it down in terms of these coefficients, then you basically keep it simpler. And you don't want to spend all your time battling algebra. So you have to get the stuff you want to get it so it's sort of in your spine. So there's the calibration. There I go through the derivation of this. I show how you can write down the model in calibrated form. So this is the way I tend to think about models is give me my value shares, give me my reference quantities, give me my elasticity. So here I have a function that it's the same utility function, but I just substituted in the value shares and the reference quantities. That gives me the elasticity. That's a money metric utility. So that's just some algebra about how we do this stuff. And that gives you the form. And that shows you the intuition. Should he move? That shows a housing value share and elasticity substitution. So if the elasticity is high and the value share is low, anything above the red line is going to be good to move. Anything below the red line is going to be bad. So it depends on how much money I'm currently spending on housing and my willingness to substitute. And that's,
Well, we can take it, I mean, I don't wanna make you late for your thing.
yeah, so I should go, but it's,
But we can take a look at this, CES stuff, people on the call if they want, over these 30 minutes. and if
I
they
don't
have-
think
I think I
it's-
prefer that. Why don't we take
we
the
don't-
break?
I don't have that yet.
Why don't we take a break for 15 and then you guys come back and work on the assignment from yesterday? When you
Okay.
Come back, let's pick up the assignment.
Oh.
Okay.
Okay, do you need half an hour?
It would be good if you took a break 15 minutes and then work for half an hour. I'll be back at 11:15.
Okay,
Okay.
go ahead. Yeah, that works. I don't wanna make you late, because I know this is,
Trying to-
all right, so we'll be back at 11:15.
At 11:15, 12:15 for.
And we'll work
Are you
on
talking-
the homework set, just the stuff we didn't finish up yesterday.
Okay,
Okay.
and in the afternoon, we're gonna pick up at 4, right?
Yeah. Yeah, we'll pick up at number 4.
Number 4, okay.
Okay, then I'm ending the call.
Yeah.
See you soon.
See you in 45 minutes.
Thank you.